Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel, and today I was going to try something somewhat different. I have a project that I'm working on for one of my history classes, but I also think this would be a really good way to jumpstart my history portion of my channel. I've been looking to do this for quite a while, actually, since I've become a history major, if some of you do not know, and I have been very interested in talking about various things that interest me, such as Portugal, which has slowly become one of my favorite parts of the world. So today I wanted to talk about how Portugal was somewhat distant in the World War era in comparison to, of course, everyone else in the European and essentially the entire world was in that war. For instance, Portugal did not even fight in the Second World War, which, if some of you know history, which is very interesting because there's been an alliance between the English and the Portuguese that dates back all the way to the 1400s. And so this ancient alliance that has, been honored actually in combat and in all sorts of things by both the British and the Portuguese forever, seemingly wasn't fulfilled, except that it was. For instance, in the Great War, World War One, when World War One began, England was the country that actually declared war on the Central Powers. Not they were not actually declared war on. They were technically the aggressor, and so Portugal actually came out with a statement, kind of amusingly, and said, "We are still maintaining our treaty, but we're not going to join. Have fun," essentially. And it gets even better. According to the American University International Law Review, a journal from the 1998, that Portugal actually, at the onset of World War II, announced officially on September 1st, 1939, that England did not ask for Portugal's assistance and that the alliance was still intact, which means the Defensive Pact survived 2 different world wars and several different governments, as I will get into later. So, why might that be? Why might the Portuguese want to stay out of these wonderful, bloody conflicts of the 20th century? Well, are plenty of reasons for that. One of which, for instance, being just the weakness of their merchant fleet. As of 1914, just in capacity for cargo, the Portuguese merchant fleet was less than 1% of the total capacity of the British fleet. This is according to Miguel Castro Brandão in the Essays in Economic and Business History article from 2021. In this article, he talked about just the same issue I'm talking about, how the war at sea and during World War One actually was. That's what Portugal's main contribution to the war would be, is using its fleet, and that would be a very serious problem. The Portuguese were at one point an empire that spanned a lot of the world. They did not control as much as England did, of course, at the time, but the Portuguese had reach via their navy across literally everywhere. In fact, Portuguese explorers made it all the way to had exclaves in India and all sorts of things, and that kind of thing. And so the Portuguese navy was always a big deal in their economic and militaristic success. However, if you have only 1% of what the English fleet has, and to be honest, while the English fleet was the biggest in the world, it wasn't that impressive. How are you going to turn that into a military that is capable of fighting, say, the Germans? You really can't. There aren't enough ships. And as well, Portugal at the time would have been incredibly dependent on its overseas trade for money to pay for these weapons, and thus all of that would be an issue. Brandão states further that the majority of Portugal's fleet was actually outdated and even unprepared for oceanic and long-distance journeys. And this is a serious problem because a lot of Portugal's colonies and wealth that they would need to draw from if they were to actually be helpful in a war like this are all overseas. Of course, you have places like Brazil and beyond that it would need to trade with, and then you have Portugal's actual colonies, some of which are in Africa, some of which are elsewhere, that they need to actually be able to get to using vessels. And if you don't have access to that, and you have ships that were built, say, in the 1800s, that's going to be very difficult, very costly, and you might lose ships in the process, something you definitely could not afford in a wartime. And so essentially, Portugal looked at that just by itself, to be honest, and said, I feel like attacking Germany would be a problem. Worse yet, Spain during World War II was an ally of the Nazi Germans. So after Franco won the revolution and took over Spain, they were essentially allied with the Nazis, since the Nazis actually helped. Hitler, as a little known fact, Hitler helped Spain's nationalists win the revolution using specifically the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, to bomb cities and such. And so the Portuguese, being on the wrong side of that, puts a much larger neighbor and the entire force of Central Europe against Portugal, or at least that's what it would have looked like in 1939. So they essentially were stuck between an ocean and a hard place with that idea as well. So neutrality was probably the best play for them right then. Another thing that could be the reason for this apathy towards the world wars, at least until they were forced to join the first one, for instance. But another reason for this is the government style of Portugal at the time of both wars. In the First World War, for instance, there was a serious issue within the Republic with even joining the war in the first place. So in 1916, the Portuguese were worried about the British putting something into the End Treaty, which would eventually, of course, become the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. But they were worried about the Portuguese colonies being traded away in some way to some other power or to England or something. That strange and harmful to the Portuguese, so they joined reluctantly, extremely reluctantly at that, to attempt to preserve some portion of their empire. This did not go over well, and shortly after, in 1926, a coup actually occurred, and the first dictator of the new, much more fascist-style government under a man named Oliveira Salazar took power in 1928. And he proclaimed this new state, which was much more authoritarian in nature than that of his what would be the allies, in theory, of both nations. So not only was the original Democratic Republic in Portugal completely against the concept of joining the war anyway, but the successor government, the successor fascist government, wanted to distance themselves from the freedom just a little bit. As my professor, Dr. Byers, said, it's more of the dictators wanted to have their cake and eat it too, and thus remain neutral and fascist. So essentially, the war that ended fascism, World War II, just carefully ignored the existence of Portugal's government. As I said, there was a serious ideological divide between the Allied forces that they would have ended up joining inevitably. They wouldn't be on the side of Germany just because of how concerning Germany was, as well as the fact that Spain has kind of always been a back and forth force in Portuguese history. They're either allies or absolute enemies fighting each other, so they've always kind of been distant, and they wouldn't necessarily want to be on the same sides, especially with the concept of communism coming in. There were concerns that communism that communist forces from the USSR had been influencing the revolution a little bit, and that was a very bad look in the very anti-communist Portugal at the time. And so once the Allies consisted of France, England, and the Soviets, that was a very taboo group to be in. Communism and fascism are inherently counter ideologies. So fascism is essentially the religion of the state, the belief that the state should encompass everything in all parts of your life. And the other one, which is similar, the communism, is supposed to be for the people, but it ends up becoming a fascist state eventually, as they all do. But the communist regimes always end up becoming these collective anti-capitalist groups, and the anti-capitalism part runs very counter to both democratic governments like the English and fascist governments that tend to use these companies to produce things, sort of like how BMW existed under the Germans and that sort of thing. Not that companies cannot change, but they, of course, they got their money somehow, and so that of course happened in Portugal as well. So this ideological split also kind of allowed them to once again maintain the Anglo-Portuguese alliance without actually being breaching the alliance that has existed literally since the age of Castile and like the 1400s, and so it allowed them to play both sides more or less. The Portuguese government, in fact, and the Portuguese banks were allowed to effectively trade with anyone they wanted, even though towards the end of the war they favored the Allies much more. They never really committed to the Allies, of course, but they definitely threw their money towards the Allies. And then after the war, even, they definitely chose the side of the Allies. Of course, you want to choose the side of the winners, but in this case, they actually chose the side of NATO. They were, in fact, a founding member of NATO, while Portugal was still, as I would say, fascist. To explain the definition there of what I mean when I say that, it's not just a word that they throw around. That happens a lot today in modern political spheres and stuff, that the word fascist just kind of gets thrown out there on all sides of the political aisle. Well, what I'm referring to in this case is the censorship of media and the use of secret police to abuse people. Yeah, that explains pretty much everything from the Soviet Union all the way to the Haitian regimes in the late 20th century, and so that's very not descriptive, but it is essentially the religion of the state, the belief that one person or the state is supreme to everything, and then everything should be given to the state. So you are not an individual anymore, you are one with the state. And so that is what fascism actually is, and the state tells you essentially what that is. And so a lot of cults of personalities tend to come out of this. Salazar did all of these things to maintain power. He essentially abused Parliament into submission. He banned political parties, and as I said, he censored media and used secret police to beat people up. I mean, unfortunately, it's a really successful tactic to beat people up, to make them do what you want, and so that is what he very much did. In the same source aptly called "We Can't Have Reds in Portugal," this is what Anita Stelmach of the Finders Journal of History and Politics has said in the 2014 edition, is that this use of secret police to beat people into submission, literally, allowed them to remain in power for quite some time. Like, the fascist government lasted like a really long time, until actually really just with the death of Salazar. But it doesn't just end with ideology. Going back to the issue of economy, as we talked with earlier with the Brandau piece, the industrialization, or correction, lack thereof industrialization, of Portugal before and during the First and Second World War was, unbelievable. It made them essentially a third-rate power in the region, to where they probably couldn't have done anything even if they did join, other than provide manpower. For instance, I just want to read the name of this article that was in the European Review of Economic History, and it's simply, the title is "Without Coal in the Age of Steam and Dams in the Age of Electricity, an explanation for the failure of Portugal to industrialize before the Second World War." That is a very serious problem, a very good statement, without even going into the rest of the article. The lack of resources like coal that Spain had, for instance, England had, and a plethora of, Germany was capable of obtaining very quickly and effectively, and the fact that they didn't have any dams for any rivers to produce hydroelectric power also would have greatly hindered their factories' ability to produce, say, weapons, or frankly even cloth, food, clothing for your people. All that stuff is very important. It's very hard to do a lot of that without electricity, and it's very hard to do a lot of that stuff without steam power. Brandau actually states in his work, War at Sea, that a Portuguese historian in the late 19th century, Oliveira Martins, I hope I said that right, described the Portuguese economy as a country that is a vast export farm. That's not the best way to win a war, but let's continue. And he said the reality doesn't change much more throughout the years of the Great War. From 1910, it was one of the few Republican regimes in Europe, and its 1910 population totaled at about 6 million. And according to some other people that he mentions, Portugal was the poorest country in Western Europe, and its economy had more in common with the Balkans in 1914 than with the other empires that it would have been associated with prior to this time. So that leaves them at a pretty serious problem. Not only is their nation relatively small, of course, ignoring their colonial territories that they still held in Africa and otherwise, but they don't exactly have the ability to use what resources they have. If you don't have access to industrial materials, you cannot, in fact, move rocks. It is kind of difficult. I mean, you can do it, but it requires much more manpower and is much less efficient than, say, those of Germany. This would have greatly hindered Portugal's ability to provide anything, as well as upgrade the aforementioned Portuguese navy, which at the time, as I said, was only capable of moving 1% of the entire British Navy. Now, of course, the British Navy at this point was incredibly powerful, the biggest navy in the world and all that, but even for their size, they had massive needs, and the Portuguese could not fill them with that thing. They had to change something, and thus, given that they couldn't and realized they couldn't, they simply stayed out of it. It was probably a better idea. And with that, I think that is everything that I can cover today. If you liked what you saw today, and you'd like to see more of this, I think I'll be posting one of these. Maybe we'll get to like once a month. I think that would be cool, but these take a lot of work, and of course this was a final project, so I will make these take much more time, I think. But I hope you enjoyed. If you want to see my sources, I will link a lot of them in the description. Some of them I can't really because they're through like a JSTOR type service, and so I won't be able to actually link those, but I will provide some of the website links that I can get in the description if you wish to fact check what I say. And so I hope you enjoyed, and thank you very much for watching. Have a nice day.